And you do a lot of work in Jacksonville, Florida?
You have the right state.
Okay.
Which is Florida, right.
Okay. All right.
So it's actually...
It changes up my whole thing now. Darn it.
Oh, are you going to talk about Jacksonville, Florida?
Jason had some issues with Jacksonville.
I have friends. we can just get this...
Get this out of the way?
Yeah, we'll get this out of the way.
Hello, this is Pat Lynch, and you are listening to the Career Pathways Podcast. As always, we come to you weekly from the luxurious KILT studios. With me, as always, making the magic happen is producer Jayson. Say hello.
Hello, it is producer Jayson.
Have to introduce our guest, Scott Roulier, and I have to read this. So he is the David Trimble Chair of Political Philosophy at Lyon College, but you've been with Lyon over 20 years, yes?
I came in 2000.
Wow.
So
yeah.
24 years,
4
almost
years.
25 years.
But it's long overdue. We're going to have a great conversation, so welcome, Scott.
If you say so, we'll have a great conversation.
Excellent. All right.
So back to Jacksonville, Florida. You don't like Jacksonville, Florida?
So here's my issue, okay? And this is kind of like the thing. So I have friends. Honestly, I was gonna write a novel about it. It is like literally a movie, okay? I have friends. I have specifically 3 friends who are from the city, and they all live very, very, very different lives. And it is crazy how in one city, one person can literally be living off of basically rations with like houses that are falling down with gunfire coming in. Mm-hmm. And then you have somebody who lives like in an apartment building in the middle of the city, and it's like the same thing kind of, but on a smaller scale and trying to survive weekly to weekly. And then you have this rich, in beautiful houses and homes, gated off communities, and like it is just the city is like the way it's designed is just like I have friends, my friends, even like the one who lives in the gated community. I think he lives in like Orange County or Orange Park or something like that. I don't know, but he literally says like the city is just kind of a dump. Like he says like you have some really good districts like where he lives, but it's all like residential. But like the actual like business district is just kind of gross. I mean, and also I guess they technically have like TPC Sawgrass and like those rich fancy golf courses over there. But other than that, it's just like.
Well, I'm glad I'm not working in Jacksonville then. But it is true that urban spaces are diverse spaces, right? And you have all sorts of different socioeconomic classes and obviously lots of racial diversity. But anyway, so yes, it's very possible within a very small compass for people to live kind of divergent lives.
All right, well...
it's actually Gainesville, Florida is where it is, not Jacksonville.
Gainesville?
Yeah.
Okay,
so we don't have that just...
Now I have to remember because that's home of Tom Petty.
It is home of Tom Petty.
Yeah, and that's the University of Florida?
That is the University of Florida.
Gators, yep. Okay, that's...
I was there. I missed, unfortunately, this was, I don't know, maybe a month and a half ago. Every year they have the Tom Petty Festival.
Oh, wow, okay. Yeah.
And Tom Petty's sister, I'm trying to figure out, I guess we just talk, right?
Yeah.
So one of the reasons we work in Gainesville, Florida, and we've talked about this in your office, but rehash it here in front of the camera. One of the reasons we work in Gainesville, Florida, not Jacksonville, Florida, is because this institute that I'm a part of at the university, right? It's actually the Institute for Advanced Studies in Culture.
All right.
At the University of Virginia. Mm-hmm. And the person who sort of founded that is this guy named James Davis and Hunter, who wrote Culture Wars, among many other books, but he's best known probably for that. So that phrase that many people use. He's a sociologist, but so it's a typical academic sort of center of research and other kinds of things. But one of the things they have a number of different labs. They have a lab looking at sort of AI and new sort of developments on the sort of digital frontier, and they have a lab that's kind of dedicated to looking at sort of democracy, and a lab that is committed to urban issues. So that's called the Thriving Cities Lab. So that's part of this institute. Anyway, one of the board members of the Institute for Advanced Studies in Culture is a woman named Phoebe Miles.
All right.
But her maiden name is Phoebe Cade, and her father was an endocrinologist at the University of Florida, and he is the inventor of Gatorade.
All right.
So it's a long story, but suffice it to say, the University of Florida gets a lot of the money from Gatorade, right. But there's still money that the family has, the money the family has for a kind of foundation. And Phoebe is from Gainesville, and she loves her city, and she and her husband, Richard, who's a former sort of Bush White House official and has been in the State Department, right. As a diplomat for many, many years. They actually have a museum that they have built on an old brownfield site, industrial site, and it's basically a museum dedicated to inventors. So it's amazing. It's an amazing place. And so she had, since she was on the board, she knew about Thriving Cities, the Thriving Cities Lab. She said, "Hey, Gainesville would be a great place to begin to do some of your community development,
right?
Sort of to try out your community development process." So that's how we ended up in Gainesville. Started about 2.5, almost 3 years ago.
So say 3 years ago, then you arrive in Gainesville. So you got the university, you got surrounding communities. What were the objectives? What were the plan in terms of what could be done in Gainesville?
Right, good question. I think I'm always have to be careful about my audience here. One of the things that is interesting about Gainesville is precisely both the amazing resources that exist at the University of Florida, right. Which has now clawed its way up to be in the top 5 in terms of major research universities. So it's kind of gained this new important status. So there's a lot of money and a lot of really great things happening in terms of research at the University of Florida. That said, when you think about the dynamics of the urban setting in Gainesville, then lots of people who live in Gainesville are University of Florida graduates. So it's, right. I don't want to exaggerate the degree of conflict that sometimes exists between town and gown. Right. It kind of transcends just sort of town and gown. That almost refers more to like a small town like Batesville or something. This is the problem that exists is that, you know, like any other city, there are reasons, like we could go into a couple of those, but why there is maybe a deficit of trust sometimes in city leaders, although that's improving, right. But also some frustration and lack of trust sometimes with the University of Florida. And that the latter really stems from the fact that the University of Florida already has a pretty large footprint. Yeah. And the University of Florida would say, and they're correct about this, they do amazing things for Gainesville. And there's all sorts of people who are professors and students that are doing things in Gainesville. Nonetheless, if the University of Florida wants to expand, they are really on the edge of a lot of historic Black neighborhoods. Yeah. And so as the University of Florida grows, they need more student housing. Yeah. And this is where a lot of the conflicts really arise. This problem of gentrification, the problem of the University of Florida sort of building student housing and just areas that were...
In all those surrounding areas, just even the home prices probably are they're going up astronomically. So right. That moves people out, and now they're getting pushed out of the city center.
Exactly.
Yeah, because I know, like Berkeley, California, they're just completely landlocked because they can't build any housing because no one will allow it. It's that
right.
That in that case, it's more affluent people, kind of practicing NIMBY, and so that's. But here's like a disadvantaged community in Gainesville, and I'm sure there are people that step up to help protect them, and then now all of a sudden how do you progress?
Right, and you're right. And in the Bay Area, certainly in San Francisco too, the difficulty of building affordable housing, because of people understandably wanting to protect property values and even assets, public parks, and so all these jokes about San Francisco, like we're not going to let you build this thing because you will somehow alter my view by 2 centimeters. I won't be able to see the bay by just a little bit. I mean, those kinds of things that make it really, really difficult.
With the studying urban centers, what's the future of cities? Because we were talking this earlier about cities grew and evolved and became like the place for people to be, have careers. Then people did, the families, and wanting more space, wanting a yard, wanting to have, a school for the kids. It all was the escape to the suburbs. Now,
right.
Just pre-pandemic, it was everybody trying to find their way to get back into the city center because we can't, Gen Z, millennials, that's where they want to live and work. And then the pandemic kind of threw everything up in the air, and now people are wherever, because you could work wherever. Where do you think it's headed from here?
Yeah. And only if you want to, at some point, we can backtrack to sort of what was going on in Gainesville. But
But
let's take that question because it's a good question. Then we can sort of maybe transition back. But I mean, obviously, the answer is I have no idea.
Yeah.
If I had a crystal ball, or if I'm more insightful
right.
and had greater amounts of wisdom, somebody would pay me a lot more money.
Right.
But what you describe is exactly right, and this is one of the things I think it's fascinating about studying different urban tableau, different sort of urban templates. And I mean, the way I guess I think of it is just there's kind of a dialectic that goes on. We reach these moments where we really concentrate populations in urban areas, and the urban areas for various reasons are really attractive. And then we have these moments of decentralization,
right.
where we have suburbanization, everybody spreads out, and then, whoa, you go too far that way, and then we swing back the other way. And I think that it's partly because there are unique advantages and disadvantages to these settlement types, right? So if you're thinking about a city before, now we're post pandemic, we have people doing remote work, but before that moment where everyone was moving to a city, that there's sort of, you think about the agglomeration economy that we know economically, at least historically, there have been all sorts of economies of scale that you can gain. You have all sorts of smart people concentrated in the same place, even if they've done studies, even if you have a cell phone and you're still communicating, you're texting, you're using a lot of digital media, people still really like to spend time face to face with other creative, bright people. And when you have all of those folks concentrated in one area, the way, the speed at which, the rapidity with which information can be shared, and all these collaborations that are possible because human beings are still humans, they want to have that kind of contact. So it's, you see the advantage of those kind of urban settings. Plus, I mean, there's sustainability issues that you have a smaller footprint, and you have all sorts, especially for your young people, the creative class, they want to be where there's coffee shops and music opportunities and all. So those are really attractive places.
Right.
At the same time, if a pandemic hits, and you have all sorts of people bumping up against you, that doesn't seem like it's the greatest thing. And when remote work becomes possible and you can spend a lot less money somewhere else than for an apartment in New York City, then affordability becomes an issue. So then you have this spreading out, that sort of decentralization, as you described it. There are reasons why people move to the suburbs, especially a certain time in life. And it's nice that it's kind of the American triple dream of having a house, having access to the romance of nature. So even if you're not really out in nature, but it feels a little bit more like you're out in nature. You have your sort of home, you have space for your kids and all those other kinds of things. But the suburbs also are places where, because of sprawl, you're actually gobbling up important, potentially, you're sort of moving into areas where there's other animals that used to have habitat. You have habitat loss. You basically, because of that spread, it's going to cost you a lot more money in theory to sort of get back into the city, the cost of gas and all those other kinds of things. And there's sort of a lack of, this for some people, lack of excitement in the suburbs. So all these things have their pros and cons, but you kind of see this sort of, as you said, back and forth.
Yeah, and I know Atlanta, I don't miss the hour and a half commutes that was common, and now,
Were you driving in, or were you?
Yeah.
Always. Do they have
MARTA was real. They
didn't have any lines.
It was the MARTA was worked great from the suburbs to the airport, and from the suburbs to certain specific locations downtown.
Mm-hmm.
Other than that, it really didn't provide any real help. So for most people, you had to drive, and it just was, it was just a big part of your life that, if you work 10-hour days and you add 4 hours of, combined commuting,
And this is another really interesting issue related to cities, what you're describing. I don't know, did you always work in the city? Or did you sometimes work in another suburban area? Suburban,
yeah.
See, that's the other kind of phenomenon that's fascinating. Is it used to be, you think about, people live out in these bedroom communities and they go to the center part of the city. But what was really happening is a lot of these sort of light manufacturing and other sort of office buildings are already moving to the periphery.
Right.
So what you really have in a lot of these urban areas, or sort of urban conglomerates, are this kind of suburban to suburban commutes.
Mm-hmm.
And for most cities, you definitely do not have linkages. You don't have a suburb. You don't have a subway or something you take from one suburb to another. And so all the public transportation infrastructure kind of has to be rethought a little bit. And just one little quick footnote there. It's interesting in terms of racial equity. You think about a lot of the early infrastructure, so the concept was, how do we get these people outside in? But what if you're already in? What if you're already in the city and you need to go to your job, though, is at a suburb that just doesn't have that particular connection. So you actually would prefer to have a bus. But a lot of the sort of money for infrastructure was going into infrastructure that was going to help people who were in the wealthy suburbs get where they needed to get, but wasn't really designed to help people who would benefit from more economic opportunities to get into the suburbs. So,
you wanted to circle back to Gainesville. And so, what's to kind of tell, what is the, what are you observing as far as changes taking place in that city?
Yeah, well, I think and this is not to try to be too self-effacing. I think that the work that we do is really important.
Yeah.
But I always want to say that it's the people of Gainesville that are have had the talent and the interest and the good ideas. We're just kind of coming in and sort of facilitating dialogues and those kinds of things. But when they first started, when the Thriving Cities team started in Gainesville, then I was actually living in India on a Fulbright, and so I kind of missed some of the earlier dialogues. But basically, what we did, and this is kind of relevant to what's your question, is we went in and did some original dialogues. We also did a sort of massive community level survey. And one of the ways that the Thriving Cities works is we have this thing called the civic endowment approach. Every community development group has its own way of thinking about this, but it's just very simply that we want to make sure that if you're going to have a city that's really dedicated to the well-being of its citizens, if people, you want everyone really to thrive, then you have to think about the city holistically, and you have to realize there are all these different dimensions, and each dimension really needs to be doing well. So everything from, we think about the sustainable, so that's public health and so the environment. We have the prosperous, you need to have job opportunities and thriving businesses. The just and well-ordered, that is looking at how effective your local government is.
Right.
Your planning and zoning laws, your sort of municipal ordinances, are these things are actually creating the context for people to do well? And then we have what you might call sort of classical sort of virtues, like, I think not virtues, but key ideas like the true, the good, and the beautiful. Yeah. That's just a fancy way. The true is like knowledge acquisition, the beautiful, the arts community, and the good obviously has to do with nonprofits. So, but this community level survey was looking at all these different dimensions of Gainesville. And also we did a lot of focused interviews, and part of what we got back, it sort of helps. The thing is, when you live in a city, you have a pretty good idea intuitively about what's working and what isn't. Right. But you're just one person, and you still are kind of limited. And I think what's really valuable about getting all this data, we also made all sorts of comparisons with other places in Florida and other similar sized cities. When you do this kind of survey and you pull a lot of data, you really do begin to sort of show people that there might be some blind spots, or it confirms some things that they thought. And so two of the things that emerged from that original survey, in terms of, like, we call these the wicked problems, right? And every community, every city, Gainesville's not alone, has wicked problems. But two of those wicked problems, one was a concern about third grade reading scores. Yeah. And a third grade reading score is a kind of metric that a lot of cities use. And that's just, again, this is kind of this uncomfortable disconnect that exists in Gainesville between this huge, very prestigious university sitting right next door to a public school system that, again, with amazing teachers who care about their kids, but in terms of some of the outcomes are less than desirable outcomes. And so that's a kind of painful dichotomy. Yeah. So there's a concern about early childhood learning. And then the second thing that came up was affordable housing. Right. And we had lots of conversations with amazing young people, artists and tech entrepreneurs, and a lot of what they were talking about is like, we'd love to stay in Gainesville. This would be a great place to live, but we can't afford to live here. Right. beyond just the displacement and the gentrification things that we're talking about. So those are sort of concerns that people have, and it turns out after a couple of years, maybe one last interlude, I'll shut up here.
Yeah.
One of the things that we decided to do was to try to get people, one of the main things that Thriving Cities is all about is trying to increase civic capacity. So we're not trying to come in and say, hey, we know way more about pedagogy for early childhood learning, or we are the experts on sort of affordable housing. We've studied that and know something about that, but that's not really our expertise. The main thing that we're really about is trying to take cities that have some of these divisions that a place like Gainesville has, where maybe there's not a lot of good collaboration happening because of some of these conflicts, and trying to increase civic capacity. And all civic capacity it's about things like more distributed leadership. Mm-hmm. It's about sort of facilitating more collaboration. It's about leadership, recruitment, and development. And really, it's trying to put a city in a place, in a community where they can solve their own problems. Right. And that's in all these amazing resources, but they're not rowing in the same direction. And so we wanted to find a project that was less controversial. There's enough controversy in Gainesville. Yeah. And so in Gainesville, there's this beautiful stream, the Sweetwater, that basically goes to the middle of the city. And there's also one of the things that was a dream of many people in Gainesville that hasn't really been fully realized is having a sort of a greenway, this recreational greenway that would go through the center of the city and would cross into 3 historic neighborhoods, 3 black and 3 white. And part of the greenway has been built up, but much of it hasn't. So one of the things we wanted to do was to create a festival, a Sweetwater sort of festival. And it also was tied to this really amazing African-American woman who ran this little restaurant and bar that she used to allow back in the sort of kind of in the early 1970s and 60s. She would allow University of Florida musicians, even in spite of segregation, they could come and sort of play in her place. Her name is called Sarah's Place. So we kind of combined sort of Sarah and Sweetwater, called Sarah Sweetwater Greenway Festival, and each neighborhood had a chance to have one day that they could tell their story, and we gave them some grant money to have arts folks come in and musicians. And so over several days, people could kind of go each one of these neighborhoods. They could also see where the greenway, if it had been built, if it were to be built out, where it would go, and why that was so important to sort of build that infrastructure. So it was a really, really positive experience. And yes, even in those neighborhoods, there's some, because of the gentrification displacement, we had some kind of dicey dialogues with people. But it was really great to see, give people voice to express their frustration. And yet they also are very much a part of this festival. So that was a really good thing that has led to the city sort of embedding this greenway. At least that's one of their goals, is to sort of complete that. And also there's this sort of group called Wild Spaces that has some money to dedicate to that, finishing up that greenway. So that was kind of part of our process, is to pick something that everyone could get behind initially. Now, starting in phase 3, we're probably going to be looking at early childhood and youth sort of issues, and that could run the gamut from there's some gun violence in Gainesville. It could be early childhood kinds of issues and other kind of youth and childhood issues, and we'll be probably working and partnering with a number of different, there's a community college there it's a great partner, and some community foundations, and a number of friends that we've made over time. And the point is not for us to go in and say, here's what you all need to do. It's to have these community dialogues, pulling together people from these different civic endowments and having them kind of envision what they want to do and what strategic projects they want to be a part of to address some of these issues. So anyway, that's kind of where we are right now.
Now, the word thriving cities, as far as that whole initiative, for a city to thrive, does it need to be adding population, growing? Is that or is that just not really the case? I mean, it could be exactly what you want it to be, headed in the right direction and have stable population.
It's a very good question. I mean, I think it depends on who you ask, right?
Yeah.
So for many people, if you were to describe a thriving city, they would imagine and envision that means we must be gaining population or we must be expanding, right? I don't really think of it that way. I mean, I think that what you want economically, you can think about John Stuart Mill's steady state economy. I mean, what you want is whatever level population that you have, you want to be increasing your human capital so that people are getting the education they need so they can create new businesses and new ideas or be the kinds of workers you need for these new kinds of jobs. And just, I think what you want is more, entrepreneurial sort of opportunities. You want that kind of human capital growth and more sort of, and, the population growth will sort of come. And as you know, I mean, that's both that's a blessing and a curse. And so I don't think that we really focus on certainly don't focus on economic growth exclusively with our holistic view. And we certainly don't think of it in terms of population growth. We're really kind of trying to immediately work with the people who are already there and trying to figure out how can we sort of move you from this place of, again, tons and tons of potential and talent and resources, but these resources are not necessarily being paired together. They're not sort of, there's not a lot of synergy sometimes. So how can we sort of put things back together a little bit so that you can accomplish more?
And the way I look at like great cities, vibrant cities, are where people, where they want to live and work, and definitely live there. So New York, Chicago, everybody, okay, you dodged the gunfire, but I mean, really, Chicago, San Francisco, but those, that's, and I know like my experience like in Atlanta downtown was really not much. It was like Atlanta, the adjacent suburbs were very vibrant, and that's where a lot of people lived, but it wasn't really what you call like that vibrant type of city. Miami, I think, would probably throw that in there. Where in all that is with Gainesville? How would you kind of classify and consider Gainesville?
I mean, I think that this is one of the things, this is why we kind of focus on civic capacity, because a lot of the pieces of the puzzle are already there. You think about I mean, in terms of knowledge acquisition, you have the community college in Gainesville. It's called Santa Fe. I think in 2015, they won the award for the top community college system in the country. It's led by a president named Paul Brody. He's an African-American guy. He's just an amazing leader. But you also have the University of Florida sitting right there. So you have amazing resources in that respect. And you have, again, a bunch of startups that are going on in Gainesville, kind of tech startups, but also just you have kind of a government sector, and you have a large university sector, and there's so many spinoffs from biotech and other things they're doing. There's a lot of economic activity. So the prosperous, I mean, the true, and and this is an example of, I mean, so if you look at each piece separately, and a good example, this is we call it the good, like the nonprofit sector. We kind of kid about how every single person who goes to Gainesville has a trailing partner. Yeah. And they have nothing to do while their partner is in grad school or whatever. So I'll start a nonprofit. So it's a city of like 1,000 nonprofits. But if you have 1,000 nonprofits, everyone's just trying to make enough money to pay their staff, which might be one person. And so part of also what we're trying to do is we're working with community foundations to kind of help them think about their grant sort of process and how to sort of incentivize more collaboration and how to help these nonprofits sort of work together a little bit. But yeah, I think there's a lot of pieces of the puzzle. For Gainesville's fortunate to have a lot of that. The problem is some of the events that have taken place over the last 10 years that have led to a lack of trust in the city, or because of the dynamic of the university growing and being both helpful but a threat. That's not. I mean, it's made it a little more difficult to have those pieces of the puzzle pull together in such a way you could say that the city is fully meeting its potential or something.
Yeah. Now, Florida as a state is a little more politicized than some others. So, you got DeSantis kind of, it's not even a guiding hand. Maybe it's more of a heavy hand in certain things. Definitely at the university level. Has that kind of changed things from your perspective?
There is that kind of, you can call it paternalism. You could clearly. I mean, it's a overall it's a kind of conservative red state, but it's still has a lot of democratic elements. And in Gainesville is sort of like the Austin of Florida, right? It's a blue little bubble.
Yeah.
And one of the things that's interesting is this institute that I was talking about. One of the things that this institute is going to be spending a lot more time doing in the next several years. There's some grant money, hopefully, that's coming to sort of enable us to do this, but is really kind of looking at democratic backsliding, concerns about sort of the status of democracy. And so for me, and for those of us who are working with thriving cities, don't want to make any extravagant claims about our community development process, but I think that, how do you put a democracy back together if you feel like some of the threads are starting to unravel? And for me, I did my graduate work at the University of Virginia, and the University of Virginia is haunted by Thomas Jefferson. But Thomas Jefferson has this idea. When I teach Jefferson in my classes, I kind of talk about him as a small D Democrat, not sort of a big Obama D, or certainly not. And it's because of his commitment to education, his commitment to things like inheritance taxes and graduate income taxes. A little bit concerned about sort of social economic equality. But so one of the things that he sort of thought would be good was to create these wards. So we still have the idea of the ward when we think about, okay, what ward do you live in for voting? A lot of times now when we use that word, they were just talking about where in the city do you live, and so where do you go to vote? But a ward in the Jeffersonian sense was kind of these like 1 square mile places where people could really have a hands-on opportunity to learn they might get a chance to be a leader. They might be on city council. It's kind of like a small township or something, like a town meeting. But people have an apprenticeship in citizenship, and they'd also actually have to talk and work together.
Right.
And so I see thriving cities being connected to this larger project of, again, it's not the only thing, but one aspect of trying to begin to reweave the threads together by starting. Where do you start? You have to start with cities and at the local level. And I think that local politics, as fraught as it can be, just like at the national level, in some ways, there has to be more pragmatism, because there are things that people will say on social media, horrible things they'll say about people because they're not face to face with them. No. I might say something horrible about you. No, right. No, but but because if I'm your neighbor, I'm less likely to do that.
Right.
And also, our kids have to live together. We have to figure out a way to craft and to sort of come up with a common life, because we live in the same space, and we pragmatically are willing to kind of shed, or at least put aside a little bit, some of the most ideologically polarizing kinds of things. And so I think that there's a kind of great pragmatism that you find at the local level, precisely because people want to make sure the stoplights work. They want to make sure there's a park. They want to make sure these kids have decent schools. So a lot more ways to get on the same page. And you can kind of begin to scale that up. If you can get people to once again learn how to talk across differences, and to begin to quit demonizing each other, that's something you can build on. Yeah. So I see that the project of Thriving Cities is also kind of very much tied into the project of democracy building more generally.
Yeah.
I have a question actually about specifically about public transportation. So it's kind of weird, but in at least in the time we're living in 2024, it almost seems as if public transportation, specifically trains and railways and buses and stuff like that, it's almost kind of left leaning. And I just want to know why that is, and why it's not really a concern for people who are kind of on the other side of this scale, and why that kind of isn't more of more talked about. I mean, it's kind of a lot of people's way of getting around this public transportation stuff.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think it's a good question. I mean, I don't presume to know what goes through the minds of people.
Yes, you do.
No, but I think specifically why that might be construed as a slightly more left-leaning concern. There'll be a couple of reasons for that. I think one is infrastructure is expensive.
Yeah.
And so historically, if you are a person who's more conservative and you're concerned about fiscal integrity, and you think, look, we spend all this money, and some of these projects take longer, and they cost more money than they say they're going to cost. So I think part of it is kind of just a fiscal conservatism and being careful about that. And then trying to still be diplomatic about this. It's not that, I lived in Virginia for a while. I wasn't living in Northern Virginia. My wife grew up in Northern Virginia. But there are people who are wealthy folks who live in the suburbs who use the subway system, right? Use the train system in DC, and it's a fantastic system. But I think a lot of folks, we talked about the American dream with the house in the suburb. Another thing Americans love is we like automobility. Right. And with the emphasis on automobility, you might be willing to ride with somebody else in your car. We'd love to have our own cars, with our own music that we're playing, temperature control the way that we want, and we want to have absolute control, maximum control over when we want to go to work and leave work and all those kinds of things. And so if you're going to drive all the time, Americans are sort of just obsessed with driving, then that's where you're going to get a lot of political support for spending money on roads and bridges and fixing those kinds of things. Even if I lived in Europe for, on many occasions. And I love Europe. Not that I say I love it more in America, but being able to get on a bus or a train is just so incredibly convenient, and amazing trains. I mean, trains that actually really run on time and are super fast and all those kinds of things. So wouldn't we benefit, not just Democrats, but also Republicans, everybody, for having a better transportation system? We're also really spread out. It's harder to sort of invest in infrastructure sometimes when you have people that are, in the middle of the country where there's not a lot of density. But
and it's cultural.
I was going to say, do you ever see a time, we're getting arguably more progressive about stuff like that, trying to adopt a lot of European stuff like that. Do you think that, I heard a big thing about Amtrak trying to get a big rail system to connect the West, specifically from the South to Minneapolis to Seattle and all those places over there, because there's not really a reliable continental train system. Do you ever see a time where maybe we come together to kind of say, okay, we want to kind of have the ability of being able to do public transport all the way from Seattle to Minnesota to Arkansas to California, stuff like that? I
would love to see that. Whether I think that'll happen anytime soon, the problem is there's so many different national priorities about things we need to spend money on. I mean, and right now, because I was talking about the driving, we already have this sort of crumbling infrastructure. I mean, the bridge that fell in Baltimore wasn't because it crumbled, it's because a ship hit it. But I think that's probably some backfilling just to kind of take care of that basic infrastructure. I don't know. I think we might be able to get the political will to do that. I think everyone benefits from that. But for the reasons where for some people it's still considered, when they hear public transportation, that sounds like socialism. I mean, anything. Why should it's about privatizing things, right? It's why would we invest in these public kind of goods anyway? I think that's sometimes the problem.
Yeah, in Atlanta, with traffic's just horrible, and they've had in my time there 2 different referendums for voters
for light rail or something.
Yeah, just the transportation bill, and they both failed miserably because of distrust, and it was it was solely they didn't trust that the state government would responsibly use the money, and this was Republican, governor, these were, and didn't matter what what political party you were. It's just they didn't think that, oh yeah, we're going to put all this money and you're going to go and create bike trails and all these things that we don't need. What we need are more roads. Right. And then it's well, no, that all you're doing is you're perpetuating the problem, and so it just died.
Isn't that the joke that all traffic can be solved with just one more lane?
Yeah. And we say when more people come. I think my wife's a physician, and she's a family practitioner, but she also has a specialization in lifestyle medicine. And I mentioned that just because I think building political will has a lot helping people see the connection between the built environment and these other problems that we have. Right. And so, there's so many different things that ail Americans, where it's high blood pressure and heart disease and diabetes and all these things. And a lot of it has to do with, people not really sometimes having access to be able to sort of exercise, or they're living in a food desert and they don't have access to sort of good, healthy food. But I think if we can, you talked about, because you mentioned the bike lanes and other kinds of things. I think, as more people begin to sort of demand, I want to ride my electric bike. I want to be able to get into the city I can save a lot of money, and I can actually maybe get some exercise going. Be able to see it again. It's not so just it's not just for this group of people or that group of people. it's sort of part of a large scale effort to decrease the cost of healthcare, getting people healthier, longevity, to see that infrastructure is a much bigger kind of thing than just how to get to my job or something.
All right, dramatic change of subject.
Oh yeah, okay.
You got all these cool things that you've done. You're Fulbright in India.
Mm-hmm.
Kind of, well, tell us about what your experience was all about, and then just, I mean, you got a chance to see India. I mean, we read about it. It's not covered nearly enough on this side of the world. So there's, Modi, big. Maybe there's some natural disaster. That's about it.
Right.
So
exactly.
I'm sure they have like thriving cities is fascinating, but India must have just been an experience all to itself.
Yeah, I mean, I think that I know that you were about a year ago. I gave a talk at the college, but I probably said at that point. I mean, I'm always hesitant to say something like, I've traveled a lot, but I mean, the truth is I have traveled a lot.
Yeah.
And so I've been in a lot of parts of the world. And the thing, one of my first observations is just that even though I've been to some very interesting places, there's again a kind of, take a place like Turkey. So clearly you're sort of an Islamic society in that what you're seeing visually, all those signs are about, this is the kind of culture that you're in. It's amazing. It's beautiful. I mean, Turkey is beautiful. Istanbul is beautiful. But just using that as an example, or Kyoto. So you're in Japan, and you're just like, it's clearly a Japanese template. Like this is what you're seeing, and all the people walking around with kimonos, and it's amazing sort of Japanese aesthetic. It's very consistent and beautiful and rich and deep. When you go to India, it's just, I've never been in a place that is so incredibly diverse. So you are with people who are from different castes, and you have different sort of versions of, kind of Hinduism. And you have obviously people who are, who are Muslims that are around, and you have Sikhs, and so all these religious, caste, and cultural differences. It's just this dizzying array of cultural difference, which made it, probably one of the most fascinating places I've ever been. But yeah, I was fortunate to spend, just a semester there. But what I was doing, I was using kind of some of my interests in urban. I'm a political philosopher by training, so my early work is in German political philosophy. But kind of what I started to do over time in my career was begin to sort of try to combine some of my interests in theory and more sort of practical urban policy and design and those kinds of things. So I have a friend that I've collaborated with, or that we have a lot of conversations. He's Indian, and he's at the University of San Francisco, but he had gone to this architecture school in India called CEPT, and it's in Ahmedabad, which is in Gujarat in the western part of India. And I was thinking about, as at the stage of my career, I want to do something different, and I thought, well, maybe I'll try for a Fulbright. So I was at CEPT University, is a urban planning and architecture school. And they have some other degrees as well, but that's kind of their main focus. And it's kind of a famous place. And so the president of CEPT is actually this person named Bimal Patel, who is known in the press as Modi's architect.
Okay.
So he is a kind of slight bespectacled intellectual who did his PhD at the University of California at Berkeley, but he is kind of totally tied to this very sort of BJP, kind of muscular Hindu nationalist party.
Right.
So Bimal is a pragmatist. He would just claim that he agrees with everything that Modi does. He just likes to build things, and Modi's a guy who's going to let him build all sorts of things. So he's all in. So when I went to Ahmedabad is one of the bigger cities in India, but Bimal his company had built one of the first riverfronts in India, and that was in Ahmedabad. So I was kind of looking at some of the social, economic, ecological aspects of this riverfront. That's part of kind of what I was doing. I was doing a little bit of teaching and other kinds of things. But yes, so I mean, I think in terms of Modi, maybe I like lots of anecdotes. Maybe one anecdote that was sort of interesting was while I was there, they're always having elections. Elections in India are super complicated because they have them over long periods of time because it's such a huge country. And this is not unusual, but in one particular state, I think it was Uttar Pradesh, that there was a local election, and the Conservative Party, Modi's party, is the BJP, and one of these sort of fiery leaders was a former, or still is a monk, kind of Hindu monk, and he was making really threatening statements, encouraging violence against people of the Islamic faith, and also
like
to
make India great again.
and even like we might have to. I mean, it was pretty edgy, and it was very threatening. And I remember thinking, man, is this the kind of rhetoric that you would allow to happen in this country? This is a country of, the Congress Party, right? This is people like Gandhi and others who sort of in the early stages did everything they could to sort of make sure that people of the Islamic faith could still be here, even though they were going to be a minority. So anyway, I remember reading about this, and again, it was basically fomenting violence against Muslim people. And I sent an email to a couple of my colleagues at the university that I knew and not super well, and I said, I just read this thing. This sounds kind of scary. I mean, what do you think about this? Crickets.
Oh.
And I think the longer I was there, I mean, I had some other friends who I could have political conversations with. But people even in the academy, I'm pretty used to academic freedom here. I think because of Modi, people were really scared.
Oh.
So there have been people who lost their jobs at universities. So there's a real crackdown on anybody who crosses the line and seems like they might be too critical of Modi. So I think
he seems real genteel. He comes off as being this very friendly, and it's anything but that.
Kind of this person who's just sort of the father
man
of the nation,
people.
Man of the people. My father was a tea seller, a chaiwala,
right.
And he kind of has this, he channels a kind of almost like sort of, but I mean, you hear him speak, he has these elements of sort of a fiery populism, and then he can fall back into a sort of Gandhi son of posture. But I would say that, the time that I spent there, I had lots of conversations with people who were Muslims, and they were very fearful, and they had already experienced sort of consequences. And as I said, even in academic settings, there are people I knew who lost their positions. So the level of freedom of expression and feeling comfortable with dissent was starting to really, that was kind of being lost, or not completely, but people felt there's sort of a chilling effect on speech and communicating ideas that were contrary to the sort of the Hindutva politics of Modi. And then specifically sort of, you have people concerned about, your cows obviously are sacred. So we have these claims that somebody who was this Muslim group had sort of somehow slaughtered a cow, whether they had or not. And then you get this pretext for people to go and kill Muslims. Anyway, it's a pretty, the sort of democracy as we knew it in sort of the early stages of India, I think it's really becoming more and more that the BJP is turning this into a kind of Hindu nationalist state. It's not quite there, and there's still the courts, but the courts have also been intimidated. So it'll be interesting to see.
Yeah, you hear, like, or the way I kind of pick up news is that it's kind of a given that China is this economic miracle. They've lifted all these people out of poverty, and it's become kind of a world power in a relatively short period of time. India, it's like, yes, things are improving, but it's like India just hasn't quite got its act together. Is that kind of accurate, fair statement, or I mean, what are your thoughts?
I mean, I think one of the reasons that Modi can be popular is he early on, let's say maybe like 15 years ago, you would not necessarily have thought of the BJP party as a party that was a big supporter of corporate capitalism and sort of a real sort of booster for economic development. But that's completely changed with Modi. Right. And so I think that what you find in India is a country that's developing very rapidly. And talk about infrastructure. I mean, that infrastructure, unlike the United States where things are really slow, I mean, things are going up really new cities, new office complexes, new flyovers, new roads, new highways, new train sort of lines, tons of new, as I said, just new ports that they're building. So Modi is really on the development train.
Are those new cities like versus like the ghost cities that you hear about in China? Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think most of the places, when I think new cities, at least new development in key cities.
They're
like already in Hyderabad, they're already in Mumbai.
Yeah, it's not that they just, it's more of a giveaway, let developers kind of build them, and then people will come and then they can't afford it.
There's this kind of like, there's some cynicism that even in Ahmedabad, in Gujarat where I lived, between Ahmedabad and Gandhinagar, which is actually the official capital now of Gujarat, they've built this kind of high-tech city where people have residential capability. You live there, you have some restaurants, little things. Mostly it's just this high-tech center, and I kind of heard mixed reviews about how successful that actually has been. It's not a ghost city.
Yeah.
Whether it is sort of delivered all that it's promised, I don't know. But I think that a lot of people see India. China has, both these countries have a lot of problems. India has problems because it doesn't have, a ton of resources or water. Yeah. which is a problem. You have this massive population, but because of China's one-child policy, China is also looking down the future of some of the consequences of that. Whereas India has a lot of people and they have a lot of things that they can do. So there seems to be, certainly not saying that India in any way, shape, or form is caught up with China, but it definitely is becoming more of a rival, and that's one of the reasons the United States wants to have good relationships. India is going to sort of again play with us. They're not going to commit too much, but they realize that we want to use them as a kind of buffer to China.
And with China becoming more, it's more of a political risk in terms of just where they're headed, and so you have a lot of really important technology. That's medical supplies. We learned that in the pandemic. That are we really comfortable having them be
our primary supplier? Do we need to diversify?
So the one place to think of would be India, and yet
absolutely.
It's just I don't know if that's going to happen soon.
I think it's happening already, and I think that we obviously have a lot of back office stuff happening already in India, but India's creating its own. They're very proud of their own sort of high tech industry. But I think the supply chain problem that you mentioned, that's one of the reasons that people realize, look, we need to make sure that we are not just beholden to one particular country. And India seems very excited to sort of fill that gap.
And they also aren't they're not militarily building up quite the same way China is. I mean, they're a nuclear power, but China is making it pretty apparent, as far as they're trying to build islands, dominate big parts of the sea, and they're doing quite a bit that you can kind of see where the future's headed with them. I don't
maybe more. Maybe you could talk about in terms like more expansionist, right?
Yeah,
in terms of the Chinese, but
Silk and Belt and Road,
right? The Silk, right.
Yeah,
the new Silk Road. So I think India clearly is also trying to sort of beef up its military capability, and they have sort of skirmishes with China on sort of the northwest border. But India's not quite in the same league militarily yet, but they are definitely making strides and trying to do that.
Any plans to return? Go back there?
I've had a couple of offers to go back and do, some conferences, a couple speaking engagements. I don't know. I loved it there. If I'm going to go there, I'd rather go there for a slightly longer period of time. It's a long ways over there. I'm collaborating with a colleague, but when we presented a paper together last summer, we actually did that in Kenya, Nairobi. It wasn't in India because that's where the conference happened to be. But I would like to return sometime.
Yeah.
I mean, I got to do quite a bit of traveling, did the normal, what they call the Golden Triangle with Delhi, Agra, Jaipur, Got to go to Varanasi, which is probably one of the most, again, amazing experiences of my life, right on the Ganges. I didn't get down to Mumbai, and I didn't get a chance to sort of go, further east. And so I would love to go back. I'd just like to see whether
research. What is your research focused on thriving cities, or do you have other things in the works?
A few years ago, I published a book that was kind of looking at the relationship between democracy and urban design. And so that's still something that kind of interests me. But I have just, these are, you should never ask an academic what their research. I mean, I'm kidding. So when I was in Ahmedabad, so I have an article that's under review right now that looks at the Sabarmati riverfront from the standpoint of this interesting person, this German person named Walter Benjamin, who wrote this famous book called The Arcades Project, where he was living in Paris and he was sort of trying to dig through the detritus of material culture of Paris and the sort of the 19th and early 20th century and thinking about this kind of from a philosophical standpoint. So I kind of use Walter Benjamin as a lens to talk about the problems with when they built the Sabarmati riverfront. There were a lot of people, there were kind of slums all along that riverfront, which are not great, but a lot of those people were displaced. And I talk about some of the attempts they made to soften the blow, but also ways in which those policies failed. There are all sorts of promises of ecological improvement, which have definitely not taken hold. The Sabarmati River is one of the dirtiest rivers in all of India. And how it was used as a sort of distraction from some of the democratic sort of deterioration that was going on with Modi. And so these are kind of ideas that Benjamin is talking about in the context of France, a century earlier. So I kind of use Benjamin's theory to do that. He also wrote a really interesting essay about technology. And so this Indian colleague and I are looking more specifically at water policy and looking at the ways in which when technology changes, that technology improves, we're able to sort of replicate different things. At one point, you said to paint a picture. Then suddenly we can start to take photographs of it. What happens when you have these technologies that can quickly replicate something? And so we're talking about how these riverfronts started to sort of proliferate. And again, that's kind of using some of Benjamin's things. I am, in terms of thriving cities, I am starting to do a little more research on kind of ways in which, as I was kind of mentioned the Jeffersonian thing about wards, how we figure out more ways to communicate across difference. So I'm thinking about citizenship, I'm thinking about different forms of civil society, I'm thinking a lot about sort of democracy building, and democracy building specifically in the context of dialogue and collaboration and community level development work, to begin to sort of try to deal with some of these issues of polarization and
get community involvement, whatever level you are. That's really being a true citizen. I was fortunate, suburb of Atlanta, that I was on the city zoning board. And got to know the mayor, the council, and there's no
appointed, or were you're appointed or elected?
Appointed, yeah. And they had asked me about council, but then that's elected, and now you have to raise money, and I was like, oh no, thank you.
Right.
But have an influence. The zoning was a
huge thing,
big thing, and I tackle hot button issue like apartments. Oh no, now you're going to let in all this element that's not right for our city. Well, of course, come on, and we, and I saw the other side of it, and then I have to defend the decision. We have to sell the decision, and you really started to feel, as far as what it is like to really manage a city that's thriving, and it was a fantastic experience. And I know we have leadership Batesville and some of these things that I think they try to do
Mhm.
the same thing. Have you ever been involved locally in any way?
I was on the planning commission.
There you go.
Yeah. At one point, but no, I think Lion has kind of taken up a lot of my time.
Yeah.
I think I've mentioned this to you. The documents have not been signed. There's going to be a small rural pilot. So Thriving Cities, in its sort of original form, had done work with Orlando and Portland and Knoxville and much bigger cities, kind of large sort of aerial analyses. But we've never worked with any city that has a population lower than 150,000.
Yeah.
So starting in just about a month, we're going to be sort of working with a small Arkansas town, very close to Batesville, and kind of look at how this model of Thriving Cities might work in a rural, small town setting.
Of course.
And that's going to be exciting. We have some students who are going to be able to get involved in that, and that will have that's going to be a real kind of community dialogue, community building, Thriving Cities kind of project that kind of what you're talking about. But yeah, serving on these commissions, I think as a political scientist, it's very easy for people to think, well, politics really takes place when once every 4 years we have a presidential election, and maybe there's a Senate seat up or something, or they're always staggered. So there's a Senate seat that's up is open. Someone's up for election, and obviously there are all these sort of local things that are really important. But even beyond just sort of elected positions or appointed positions, so much of what really happens in terms of what we do as citizens, as you said, is really kind of what we're doing in our communities, and what people are doing in nonprofits who are working on homelessness, or people are working on affordable housing. So I think that it's good for students and other people to realize that there's a real opportunity and also responsibility in so many ways to sort of help be a part of making your community better.
Yeah.
That's not just at the big level. Yeah.
No, that's all right. Next dramatic change of subject. This is the Career Pathways podcast, so we got to talk careers. All right, but advice for students majoring in political science. What kind of career options? There's some obvious, probably some others that are not so. What career options are available for poli-sci majors?
I think as a liberal arts college professor, what one says about political science probably also goes for any other liberal arts kind of major. Because I think you're going to, no matter what major you have, you're going to be learning how to think critically and how to write and process information, collaborate with people, all those kinds of things. But to speak as a political scientist for a second, a lot of our students, at least historically at Lyon, have ended up going on to law school. Yeah. But we have a lot of political science majors who don't go to law school. That's not the only career path. But first of all, I think it's always important just to say that there's always the private sector. Of course, you're the person who has a marketing minor, right? And I think that's a wonderful thing, by the way, that we're starting. Okay. But I think you'd also, as a person who's been in the business world, you would confirm that you don't have to study business to do business. But there are a lot of companies and corporations that just want to hire smart people who have quantitative skills. They can read, they can write, they can think, and they're creative, all that kind of thing. So we've had students who've just gotten a liberal arts degree here in poli-sci and gone off and worked for corporations. Some of our students have gone off and they've gone into journalism.
Yep.
We've had students who spend time working. They are sort of working for members of Congress. So they are legislative aides. They are working for maybe a mayor. They're doing those kinds of things. People have gone into public relations, working for the Clinton Foundation, doing public relations for the Clinton Foundation. See, what else? I think those are so getting a degree in public policy, doing public policy analysis kinds of work for think tanks, for other nonprofits, people who sort of are leading nonprofits. I think there are a lot of options, like there are for many majors, but I think political science has kind of some good practical applications.
Yeah, Skip Rutherford connected me with the dean at the Clinton School of Public Service. Mm-hmm. We're having a conversation in the next 2 days from now on just that, just kind of learning more about that. So that,
And we've had several students who've gone on to the Clinton School. And then
yeah.
Clinton School of Public Service, or did sort of a dual degree in law and Clinton School. And so that whole realm of civil society, of nonprofit work, right? In addition to sort of normal sort of government outlets, sort of journalism or whatever, there's a lot of options besides just going to law school.
All right. Well, I think that's a fantastic way to end it. We kind of covered all parts of the world, didn't we?
We tried.
We tried to cover Jacksonville, Florida, but, but that didn't quite work.
There's nothing wrong with Jacksonville. I just don't work there.
Yeah, we love you, Jacksonville.
That's right.
But we learned all things Gainesville, all things India, and all parts in between.
Thanks for the conversation. It was fun.
Thank you. All right. And thank you for listening to the Career Pathways podcast. We are, as always, we have a new show every week, so please stay tuned and please stay listening with us. And if you want to listen to us, where can you find the Career Pathways podcast? Burning question every week. It's answered by producer Jayson. And the answer is? You can find the Career Pathways podcast on 99.97% of platforms, the same number of germs killed by Germany. All right. And we were corrected by President Melissa Taverner, who happened to be a virologist. And so she kind of challenged our assumption, but nevertheless, we're still going to go and promote it. But we still love you, Dr. Taverner. Yeah. All right. So thank you again for listening. And please visit us next week. All right.
This broadcast is sponsored in part by Lyon College and by KILT Studios.